comes to shonen anime and manga, the most powerful character in the universe is usually the main character of the universe. Naruto was the strongest person in his universe. Boruto is going to be the strongest person in his universe. And while Luffy may not currently be the strongest person in One Piece, he's working his way there. Ichigo's the strongest person in Bleach. But it doesn't always shake out like that. In fact, there are many times throughout shonen anime and manga where the main characters are not the strongest characters by a long shot. Yuji Itadori is not the strongest character in JJK. Tanjiro is not the strongest character in Demon Slayer. And Gon, while he is one of the strongest characters in Hunter x Hunter for a little bit, is definitely not the strongest character in Hunter x Hunter. But who is the strongest character in Hunter x Hunter? Well, depending on whether you've seen the anime or you've read the manga, your answer may vary. See, if you've only seen the anime for Hunter x Hunter, then you would say that the strongest person in Hunter x Hunter is either Meruem or Netero, but they're both dead, so the answer would then lay with Chrollo or Hisoka or maybe even the Zoldycks. However, if you're a reader of the manga, you might say beyond Netero or Tessierdnich, or you might even go so far as to say Kurapika. And that is genuinely the beauty of Hunter x Hunter, is that the strongest isn't really a concrete title. And it may not even be a title you want for long, because everybody who's ever held on to it either gets crippled or dies. But if it really comes down to it, the person who held on to the title of strongest in Hunter x Hunter for the largest amount of time would be none other than Isaac Netero. And while when it really came down to it and we got to see Isaac Netero use the full breadth of his power, unfortunately, he wasn't able to use the full breadth of his power, as the Isaac Netero that we saw fight against Meruem was over 100 years old, estimated to be somewhere around 110 years old. And this version of Netero, by his own admission, is only about 50% as powerful as his peak, which has made many people speculate over the years about just how well Prime Netero would have done in a battle against Meruem. Would a version of Netero that was 2 times as strong been able to defeat Meruem without the usage of the poor man's rose? Or would the outcome have been the same? Well, while I do want to talk about that hypothetical battle one day, we first have to figure out just how strong Netero was. And that is a video on its own. See, because in order to establish just how strong Netero was in his prime, we have to establish how strong Netero was in his not prime. And then we have to do a little bit of creative readjustment to scale old Netero back to prime Netero, and then, and only then, can we start talking about how he would do in a battle against Meruem. So the first thing in the long, convoluted journey to trying to figure out whether or not Netero would be able to beat Meruem in his prime is figuring out just how powerful old Netero was. And that is exactly what we're going to be doing today, because today we're answering the question, how strong was old Netero, and therefore by extension, prime Netero? That's not going to be the title. That's not catchy at all. We'll probably just use how strong was prime Netero, because you'll click that. 90% of YouTube success is just straight up marketing yourself. So with no further ado, let's get into how hard Netero punchy. Before we get into anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you guys want to hear my podcast co-host scream at me that somehow he punches harder than me, then go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Taku's Anonymous, where me and Daddy Mata, who's in a perpetual mood to fight me, break down everything that happened in anime. This week, it's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Or if you want to look like somebody who knows exactly how strong Prime Netero is, guys, go ahead and meander on over into my merch store, takusanonymous.net, where you can pick up some of the greatest anime t-shirts, sweatshirts, and sticker packs known to man. So Isaac Netero, the chairman of the Hunter Association, the strongest human being alive, the father of Beyond Netero, the man who was old when Zeno Zoldyck was born. And Zeno Zoldyck is 67, a man who's so mastered the principles of Nen that he barely leaks any at all, which has allowed him to live to the prime age of at least 110 years old while still maintaining the title of the strongest human being on Earth. And while there are other people on the planet that are roughly his age, like Maha Zoldyck, none of them have retained his fervor, his Nen application, or just straight up his strength. And all of this does genuinely come back to just how insane of a Nen user Netero was, as being able to crack the code on Nen usage can make you the strongest in the world in really any one category. However, if you're a Nen master in Netero's league, it can make you the strongest in all categories. With physical strength greater than Uguvin, speed greater than Meruem, transmutation ability better than Zeno Zoldyck, more Ren than adult Gon, wider N than Pito. Really, when it comes to any category, Netero, even in his advanced age, was truly the one above all. However, that was until he met the one person in his entire life he could go all out against. And that was Meruem, an entity only 40 days old that had already surpassed the powers of a 110-year-old Nen genius. And thus in Netero's only real battle, unfortunately, he kind of loses. Well, I guess it's closer to a tie, but we'll get into that. But why was Netero so outmatched? If he was the strongest on Earth in all categories, how was Meruem so drastically stronger than him? Well, in a very similar vein to what's currently going on in JJK, Meruem has the ability of adaptation. The durability to hang in any fight long enough to figure out the moves of the person that he's battling against and then exploit said moves. But that doesn't mean that Netero is weak, which is why I'm going to tell you all about just how strong he was. But to do that, we're going to have to start today's video in the way that we tend to start these kinds of videos off, at the beginning. See, even when Netero was young, he was revered as the world's greatest Nen user. See, prior to the current trip that's heading to the Dark Continent in Hunter x Hunter's manga right now, there had only been 5 official expeditions to the Dark Continent, one by each of the 5 V5 countries. There's now 6 countries in an agreement called the V6 countries, which is why there's a 6th expedition going. However, the survival percentage of these 5 individual expeditions is 0.04%. That means if 100 people went, only 4 would make it back. Not great odds. And Netero survived those odds not only once, but twice. And not only did Netero survived with no injuries whatsoever. See, every single one of the V5 expeditions that went to the Dark Continent brought back a calamity. Whether it was Eye, or the Hellbell, or the cannibalism disease, every single one of these individual expeditions brought back something to the V5 countries. As every single one of these expeditions also had to deal with one of the calamities that they were bringing back. So not only to survive 2 expeditions to the Dark Continent, but survive these expeditions with no lasting injuries is next to impossible, and speaks to the level of strength that Isaac Netero had in his prime. See, because like we already established, Isaac Netero in the beginning of the Chimera Ant arc establishes that he is about half as strong as he was in his prime. However, when he shows his runoff to Knuckle and Nove, who he claims to be roughly as powerful as nowadays, Knuckle and Nove are blown away. And mind you, this is his rusty Ren, as Netero hasn't been in a serious battle for 50 or so years. And that's the thing. One of the most impressive things about Netero is his Nen reserves, and therefore by extension his Ren. See, Netero more likely than not has one of the highest Nen reserves in the entirety of the Hunter x Hunter world. As when Netero realized that he had a ceiling in terms of power when he was around 40 years old, and therefore decided to go on a 5-year martial art ritual where all he did was practice one punch, on the first day of that 5-year martial arts training regimen, he keeps Ken activated for 18 hours. Now, Ken is kind of somewhere in between 10 and Ren, as your 10 is just your resting Nen that floats around your body, while Ren is you trying to put out as much Nen as possible. Nen is a defensive barrier of Nen you put around yourself that's about 10 times more than your resting 10, and keeping it maintained is incredibly taxing. However, since it's considered the best possible defense against things like Ko, which is when you funnel your Nen towards a certain spot of your body, like your fist, it's usually considered the best defensive ability, and therefore is used, albeit sparingly, by people trying to defend themselves. So the fact that Netero was able to maintain it for 18 hours before his 5-year martial arts ritual speaks to the fact that when it comes to Nen reserves, his is probably the highest in the universe. But sheer amount of Nen isn't the only thing that makes Netero strong. See, Netero was born an enhancer. Yes, an enhancer. However, he very rarely uses enhancement Nen techniques. In fact, he never uses enhancement Nen techniques. And yes, he's incredibly fast and incredibly strong, and that probably has something to do with him boosting his physical strength and speed through enhancement. There's no Jaja Ken, there's no Uvagin's right straight. Any enhancement that Netero uses is simply to make himself faster and stronger so he can close the distance on you, or just hit you really hard. And a lot of this played into his 5-year training regimen. See, because the key purpose of Isaac Netero's 5-year training regimen was to increase the speed of his punch, until eventually at the end of those 5 years, he was able to throw 10,000 punches in 1 hour, which means he was able to bring his hands from his side, put them in a praying motion, and throw a punch 3 times a second. On top of this, Netero is able to enhance things about himself that aren't strength or speed related, as Netero, simply by turning his hand into a telescope-like shape, was able to see Pito from kilometers away as if they were mere meters from him. Now, we don't technically know how this telescope technique works. It could be through enhancement, or it could be through some other form of Nen, or it could simply be from concentrating. We don't know. All we know is that Netero is the best on Earth at it. Netero is also able to massively buff his own durability, as when Netero made an entrance during the Chimera Ant arc, he fell from a height of 2,000 meters and was completely unharmed. However, even prior to that, Netero was able to slaughter dozens of squadrons of Chimera Ants all by himself while he was still warming up. Because I'd like to remind you that the red that he showed Knuckle and Nove in the beginning of the Chimera Ant arc was rusty red, and therefore the squadrons of Chimera Ants he wiped out were simply a warm-up for him, until eventually he felt strong enough to face the king. Really, when it comes down to it, the important things that he's able to enhance are his strength and his speed, which we see on full display multiple times throughout the story. The first time that we truly get to understand just how fast Netero is during his ball game with Gon and Killua, where simply by using one arm and one leg, Netero is able to keep a ball from Gon and Killua simultaneously. Well, it's one-on-one for a little bit and then it's simultaneous. And while simply using one arm and one leg and wearing wooden clogs, mind you, Netero is able to show Gon and Killua that when it comes to speed, they're nowhere near him. As when Netero briefly loses the ball as he's coming up against Gon and Killua, as Gon and Killua are closing in on it, he gets serious about his speed for a second or so, and is able to close a distance of several meters between him and Gon and Killua in the blink of an eye. But that is by far and away not his most impressive speed feat. As when Zeno and Netero are making their way towards the palace, once they come into contact with Pito's end, Pito goes to meet them. At which point Netero attacks Pito within 1/10 of a second, so hard that it sends Pito flying for literal miles. Netero hits Pito so hard that they have to conjure Dr. Blythe in order to launch themselves back to the palace. Because Pito fully understood because of how hard that they were hit, they weren't stopping soon. But ironically, Pito actually got one of Netero's slower attacks. See, I know what you're saying. Netero, when he was training in his mountains, was able to unleash 3 punches a second, and therefore his punches should take somewhere around 0.33 seconds, which is fast, but technically slower than 1/10 of a second. Well, that's because mountain training Netero wasn't actually peak form Netero. And to a certain degree, we saw a slight stripe of peak Netero in his battle against Meruem, because as Meruem and Netero were entering the final stages of their battle, there was a time when Netero threw over 1,000 strikes in a minute. Yes, that's right, at the peak of Meruem and Netero's battle, Netero was throwing 16 punches a second. Now, if you're just gonna go like that, you could probably pull off 16 punches in a second. That was the least athletic thing I've ever done on camera. However, in order for Netero to throw 16 strikes in a second, he not only has to do the praying motion and the punch every single time, but he also has to identify where Meruem is, identify the best hand to hit him with, and then throw that hand. So if Meruem was just standing still and Netero didn't have to find him and choose a different hand every single time, it's a possibility he could throw something like 30 strikes a second. And since 16 strikes every 1 second is 1 strike every 0.0625 seconds, that is where we get our attack in less than 1/10 of a second. As when Netero came to the palace, he was warm enough to throw strikes in under 1/10 of a second. And considering the fact that pre-Rose Meruem in his battle against Netero is massively hypersonic, this means that Netero's striking speed is also massively hypersonic. And that's not even to mention his superhuman stamina. See, Netero, over the duration of his battle against Meruem, throws thousands of punches. And over the course of this battle, he never once shows fatigue or even begins to sweat until Meruem cuts one of his legs off. This means that while maintaining Ken, throwing thousands of punches, 16 a second to be specific, locating Meruem, choosing the right hand to attack him with, while manifesting the 100 type botted Stoppa, which may be conjuration, may be enhancement, or may be transmutation, or may be all three, and one of the most high intensity, high speed, high power battles in the entirety of Hunter x Hunter, this man did not break a sweat until he lost a leg. And then after losing a leg, you know what he does? He simply slaps his leg and closes the wound and then doesn't lose any speed whatsoever. Yes, that's right, after having an entire leg cut off, Netero loses no speed whatsoever. And the sheer fact that Meruem was able to cut off one of his legs is wildly impressive, because Gon almost shattered his skull when he headbutted him in the abdomen, and Killua almost snapped his leg in half after kicking Netero. In both of these circumstances, Netero had to actively choose to not guard himself to his fullest abilities, because if he did, these children would have been seriously injured or dead. There's also the fact that Meruem is probably the only person in the history of people or things that would ever be able to land a hit on Netero, period. That is, land a hit on serious Netero. Because Meruem said, while Netero was fighting him seriously, that the offensive abilities that he was unleashing were perfect. That is to say that the flurry of attacks that Netero were unleashing were perfectly timed, perfectly placed, and perfectly chosen, leaving pretty much no gap whatsoever in his offense or his defense. It was only because Meruem, through the sheer circumstance of his birth, acquired some kind of pattern recognition ability that basically gave him foresight that he was able to identify and counteract Netero's moves. When I tell you that Meruem was specifically created to defeat Netero, I'm not lying. And here's the thing, Netero doesn't even have to use Nen to defeat 99% of people. Netero is the Grandmaster master of the Shingen-Ryo Kung Fu School. This is a type of Kung Fu that allows Netero to attack people with open palm strikes and attack their organs directly. So basically just with his bare hands, he's able to levy attacks that negate durability. As even if you have something like an insane amount of armor, he's able to strike through the armor and attack your internal organs directly. And the reason that Netero became the Grand Master of the Shingen-Ryo Dojo, or school, we don't know how many dojos there is because after his training in the mountains, he went to a Shingen-Ryo school or dojo and simply did one punch. And it's at this point that the master of the dojo said that Netero was now the Grand Master and that he would be honored to be his student. Now, mind you, the reason that Netero went to go train in the mountains is because he believed he reached the pinnacle of his power. But the reason that Netero left the mountains is because he once again hit that ceiling. After unleashing 10,000 punches in less than an hour, Netero was like, well, not gonna get faster than that, physically can't. And then he did in a battle against the first entity in human history that was able to fight him at his full power. Over 60 years after he left the mountains. He left the mountains at 46. But obviously the thing that makes Netero very powerful is his nen and his nen techniques, which we kind of don't know all that much about. See, we understand that Netero is an enhancer, and we know that his most dangerous nen ability is his 100 type Guanyin Bodhisattva. For those of you who don't know, by the way, Guanyin is the Buddhist god of mercy, and she is a Bodhisattva, a minor Buddhist god. Well, minor isn't the right word, but there's like levels to Buddhist gods. Guanyin is actually one of the most worshipped out of all the Bodhisattvas. So not like minor in terms of like importance to the world, but she's not a Buddha, she's a Bodhisattva. And by the way, Guanyin is only Guanyin in China. In Japan, they're Kanon. So yes, both the technique that Netero and Hashirama use are based off the same god. And usually Guanyin / Kanon has 1,000 hands, not 100. And that was today's 30-second Buddhism lesson. There will be a test. She believes in mercy. Not me. Anyways, back to the 100 type Guanyin Bodhisattva. While we're not entirely sure what nen principles make up the 100 type Guanyin Bodhisattva, it's either manipulation, emission, or conjuration. And I guess it also could technically be transmutation. That wouldn't really make like a ton of sense because that would be like, oh, I'm transmuting my aura to be like that of a Bodhisattva. See, because there's kind of a discourse as to how Netero's strongest move even comes into being. See, some people believe that he physically conjures with his aura the 100 type Bodhisattva. However, others believe that his ren, when fully released, simply takes the form of Guanyin, since we know that nen is only visible when released in massive quantities by using ren, at least without using gyo, that is. However, the idea of this Guanyin being physically manifested kind of feels like a stretch, mostly because of the way that conjuration works in the Hunter x Hunter universe. See, conjuration is usually made to make something real out of nen, like how Killua conjures his chains, or how you can conjure a shield or a sword, which is why the more prevailing theory as to how the Guanyin comes into effect is that it's a combination of enhancement and emission, which isn't crazy because we've seen emission techniques like Zeno's diving dragon take physical form. Therefore, if you can make a dragon that you can ride on using your nen, why wouldn't you be able to make a 100 armed Guanyin? And therefore, the most rock solid theory we have as to how the Guanyin works is that the Guanyin is made through the releasal of emission nen and then strengthened using enhancement nen. And then that construct is controlled through manipulation nen, through the medium of praying and throwing punches, as manipulation nen allows you to control inanimate and animate objects. And therefore, the Hunter type Guanyin Bodhisattva is manipulation, enhancement, and emission, which is kind of crazy when you consider the fact that Netero is an enhancer, and therefore his strongest technique being heavily reliant on manipulation nen, which he can only use at 60% efficiency, means that Netero's strongest move isn't even technically well suited to it. However, still with this technique, he's able to achieve strength, speed, and power unparalleled in the entire universe except for by that of Meruem. And if it really comes down to it and hands 1 through 99 aren't getting the job done, there's always the zero hand, a technique where Netero channels all of his aura into the mouth of his Guanyin, which then catches whatever enemy it wants between its two hands and focuses all of that aura in an emission blast at the enemy in its two hands. That is the only technique that belongs to the Guanyin that uses a type of nen that everybody agrees upon, as this focus blast of aura is most definitely emission, something Netero can only use at 80% efficiency. However, unfortunately for Netero, this technique using all of his aura pretty much kills him. I mean, while most people would pass out instantaneously after being drained of all aura, Netero not only doesn't pass out, even though he's rapidly aged, but he still has enough energy to take one finger and pierce it into his heart to stop it to let off the poor man's rose, which releases with a blast of 18.5 megatons. Now, a megaton refers to the explosive force of 1 million tons of TNT. The Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki during World War II by America had an explosive wield of 20,000 tons of TNT. Way too much to drop on civilians, but way less than the Rose Bomb. This means the explosion of the Rose Bomb was roughly 925 times stronger than the Fat Man. And Meruem kind of survived it, which puts Meruem's durability level very comfortably in the mountain to island range. And while the damage that Netero was able to do to Meruem without the Rose Bomb was superficial, the fact that he was able to do any damage whatsoever to Meruem does say something. So all in all, how does Netero stack up in his old man stage? Well, for attack potency, if you're counting the poor man's rose, which I'm not going to, it should be around mountain to island level. Considering the fact that the rose's explosion is a suicide attack and he didn't have the rose on his heart when he was younger, when he was in his prime, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today, I really see no reason to include the rose's explosion into the calculation of his AP. And therefore, the number one thing we should be looking at when it comes to identifying how strong Netero was in his old man state is his zero hand, as his zero hand is the strongest offensive ability he has that doesn't involve the explosion of his heart. And with the attack of the zero hand, he was able to pretty superficially hurt Meruem. And while Meruem was able to get up from the attack, dust off his shoulder, and walk towards the now rapidly aged Netero, he did have some rather large gashes all across his body. So for the fact that he was able to cut into Meruem rather deeply, who has somewhere around island to mountain level durability, the general consensus is that old man Netero's AP through the power of the zero hand exists somewhere in the region of Large Town Plus. And this is kind of corroborated by the fact that when Netero hit Pizza with one of the Bodhisattva's hands, it sent them flying for kilometers. So if hypothetically Netero were to take a swipe at the ground, he could clear out several kilometers in a straight line of any town that he attacked. And that's just with one of the 1 to 99th hands, not the zero hand. Now, the speed calculation for Old Man Netero is a whole lot easier, at least when it comes to striking and reaction time, because obviously a large amount of the battle between Netero and Meruem is Netero standing still. But as Netero stands still, he's able to strike at a massively hypersonic speed to keep up with Meruem. And since he's able to strike at this speed and react to this speed, it's pretty easy to assume that his speed is also probably massively hypersonic. Which next brings us to durability. See, unfortunately, when it comes to durability with Netero, it was kind of everything or nothing, as obviously we saw that Killua and Gon were all but incapable of injuring him in any meaningful capacity, but Meruem was able to do it with relative ease. That is to say that every single time that Meruem was able to close the distance between himself and Netero, he was able to rip off a limb. And considering the fact that Meruem wasn't trying to kill Netero, this is exactly what Meruem was going for. So it's not like Meruem was thinking, oh, I won't be able to rip out his heart. He was just trying to get Netero to stop fighting, so Netero would give up and tell him his name. Now, considering the fact that Meruem pre-Rose is considered to have somewhere in the region of small city level AP, this means that Netero's durability has to exist somewhere below that. And therefore, since Meruem with his small city AP was able to cut through Netero like a hot knife through butter, his durability is probably a notch or two down from small city level. And thus is usually agreed upon that through Rio and Co that he would be able to achieve somewhere in the region of small town level durability. But don't let that distract you from the fact that he has almost infinite stamina, as he's able to throw thousands of punches a minute, lose his arm and his leg without losing any speed whatsoever, and train for 5 years maybe without eating. And thus, with all of that in mind, we now have a picture of how old man Netero was. Which leaves us with the question, how strong was Prime Netero? Well, Prime Netero, by his own admission, was about twice as strong as Old Man Netero. But that is kind of a head scratcher. See, because everything that we saw about Old Man Netero puts him in the same ballpark as Prime Netero. So you understand that at the end of his 5-year training regimen, what Netero identified to be his true ceiling, he was able to throw 10,000 punches in under an hour, 3 punches a second. However, even in his very brief battle against Pito, he threw an attack that would have been able to be thrown 10 times in a second, as the attack was stated to have happened in less than 1/10 of a second, which means that Netero, even before he was battling against Meruem, was operating at a speed higher than that at the end of his training regiment. But who's to say that the end of his 5-year training regiment was truly Netero's peak, except for Netero, which leaves us with the rather logical question of what was Netero's peak? Was it at the end of his training regiment? Was it years after his training regiment? Or was it in his battle against Meruem? Unfortunately, the answer to that question is we simply can't know. See, when it comes to identifiable speed feats that we have for Meruem, yes, absolutely. absolutely, the fastest he ever was in his battle against Meruem. However, it would be asinine of us to assume that Netero had access to as much Nen at 110 as he did at like 46. And therefore, while it is a possibility that Netero was his fastest in his battle against Meruem, the real reason that Netero was probably his fastest in his battle against Meruem because it was the first time he ever needed to be that fast. I mean, sure, I can tell you right now, I could throw a baseball 75 miles an hour, but if you put me on the bump in Game 7 of the World Series with 2 outs in the bottom of the 9th, I'm gonna try and throw that 100 miles an hour. Because sometimes the situation necessitates a bit more juice. So let's go with the narrative that Netero actually knows what he's talking about, that Prime Netero would be 2 times stronger than Old Man Netero. Let's assume that he would have twice as much aura, twice as much speed, and twice as much strength. Well, unfortunately, when it comes to speed, twice of massively hypersonic is probably just massively hypersonic or massively hypersonic plus, which would put him somewhere around Meruem's speed. As Meruem fully acknowledged the fact that the only time that Netero was faster than him is when he was using the 100 type Guan Yin botted stop. That is to say that Meruem knew he was faster than Netero, but not faster than his strikes. If hypothetically Meruem was battling against Prime Netero, that might not have been the case. Their speed would have been a whole lot closer. And since with more aura comes more defensive ability, as if Netero had access to more aura, he would have been able to make the aura around him thicker and therefore more defensive. 2 small towns really makes a large town. That is to say, if you take his small town level durability and times it by 2, you would get somewhere in the region of large town level durability, which would unfortunately still be less than Meruem's small city level AP pre-Rose. So while Meruem would still technically have a somewhat more difficult time cutting through Netero, he would still be able to do it. But the real question is, what happens when you times small town level plus times 2? Because that's what we have to take into consideration when talking about Prime Netero's AP. See, to me, if you were to double large town level plus times 2, you would get somewhere around the region of large city. And since we can certifiably say, because someone did the math, that the explosion of the Rose Bomb is around 18.5 megatons of explosive force, which is about 925 times more explosive than the Fat Man, which had an explosive radius of roughly a mile across. This would imply that the explosive force of the Rose Bomb would be somewhere around 925 miles, which isn't how nukes work at all. When identifying the explosive force of a nuclear explosion, you actually look at the volume of the crater created by said nuclear explosion. And thus the explosive force of the Rose Bomb was calculated by looking at things like the Sedan crater, which is a crater in the Nevada desert where the American government set off a 100 kiloton nuclear explosion. Now that's 100,000 tons, which is the equivalent of 200 million pounds of TNT, or 20 megatons. Pre-Rose Meruem was able to sort of survive the explosion of the Rose. And since the explosion of the Rose would basically evaporate an entire city instantaneously, Pre-Rose Meruem's durability is city level, and therefore there is a possibility that the AP of a Prime Netero would be enough to damage Meruem. But that raises the somewhat logical question, if the zero hand that Netero fired at Meruem was twice as powerful, do we think it would kill him? And that is a tough question, because what does twice as powerful look like? I mean, obviously the zero hand that was fired at Meruem did more damage than all of the other attacks that Netero launched against Meruem over the course of their entire battle. But would a double as powerful attack do any meaningful damage when the half-powered attack only left deep gouges in his skin? And to me, the answer is no. Imagine I swung a knife at you and the knife went about a ½ inch into your skin. If I swung that knife at you with double the amount of force, the knife would go an inch into your skin, which would be way less pleasant, but it wouldn't kill you. And that's kind of the situation with the zero hand. If the zero hand, Netero's strongest offensive ability, were to be twice as powerful, I do think it would have the ability to maybe blow off one of Netero's arms or something, but I think overall it wouldn't have enough destructive force to kill him, as even the Rose Bomb that Netero used wasn't enough to kill Meruem. And the Rose Bomb is at least twice as powerful as the zero hand. So could Prime Netero beat Meruem in a fight? For the moment, I'm gonna say no. However, I reserve my right to do way more research on this topic and make an entirely new video about it once I have a more informed opinion. As today, I was more looking at the possible strength of Prime Netero than at a possible 1v1 between Netero and Meruem and how that would play out. And also, that's another good video idea, and we can't just burn those. But what do you guys think? Do you believe this is an accurate scaling for how powerful a Prime Netero would be? And how do you think a battle between Prime Netero and Meruem would play out? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Listen, if the fight hadn't ended how it ended, I wouldn't have got this really cool scene to get tattooed on my forearm, now would I?